tell your super company that you actually care whether your money is invested in nuclear weapons. I mean, most super funds probably think that people don't care, but I think that the majority of people would be shocked to hear that their money, which is going to fund their retirement, is at the same time funding nuclear weapons.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. The manufacture of nuclear weapons isn't exactly an everyday concern for most people. For starters, Australia doesn't have any. In 1973, Parliament ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, committing to a world without nuclear weapons.
Humanity is just one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation.
Australia will never seek to acquire nuclear weapons. We do not seek that nuclear capability.
We need the treaty of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons as much as ever.
But what about this strategic issue about whether or not we could ever acquire or develop nuclear weapons in this country, whether a government would ever condone that?
Well, I think in many ways it's the wrong question, because I don't actually think getting into an arms race with China is a sensible proposition.
But new research shows that many Australians may be more involved than they realise. According to new research from Quit Nukes and the Australia Institute, as many as 14 major superannuation funds have invested in these weapons of mass destruction. 2 even invested through their, quote, responsible super options. Joining me today to discuss the superannuation industry's investments in nuclear weapons is Margaret Beavis, co-director of Quit Nukes and co-author of this report. G'day, Margaret.
G'day.
And also with us is Adam Gottschalk, and Kantor Fellow at the Australia Institute and one of the researchers on this project. G'day, Adam. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Ebony. Thanks for having me on the show.
I'll start with you, Margaret. Can you tell us about Quit Nukes and why you do this work in general?
Quit Nukes is a project that's been going since 2019. It's a combined project of, and there's the Medical Association for Prevention of War in collaboration with ICAN Australia, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. Why are we involved in this? Nuclear weapons are a major threat globally, and one of the ways to increasingly make them illegitimate is to say it's not okay to fund the manufacture of these weapons. We have to get rid of these weapons before they actually get rid of us. And continuing to fund these weapons is giving permission for these weapons to be made and threaten us globally.
So, Adam, you scoured a lot of the data for this report. What did you find?
Yeah, so essentially we looked at the 14 biggest public offer super funds in Australia, which just means super funds that are open to any member of the public. And we looked at their default investment options, and then we looked at their ethical, socially responsible, socially aware options, which apply various environmental and social exclusions to their investments. And what we found was that 13 of these 14 biggest funds had investments in nuclear weapons companies, and those investments amounted to a total of $3.4 billion. So it's really a lot of money. And I mean, it's worth noting that these investments were a small percentage of each fund's overall investment portfolio, but, a small percentage of a lot of money is still a lot of money. So Australian Super, for example, had the biggest investment in nuclear weapons companies. That was $1.5 billion. And only one of them, Host Plus, had excluded nuclear weapons companies since 2021.
Yeah, that's quite shocking. Margaret, a new United Nations treaty entered into force in January 2021 with respect to nuclear weapons.
I am pleased to recognize today's entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Atomic weapons will effectively be illegal under international law. But there's a problem. The world's 9 nuclear-armed states did not take part in the talks at all.
International law says you can't have nuclear weapons, right? So you have to give them up now or decide that you will remain outside the structure of international law, and you have to decide how you want to deal with this.
Can you tell us about that treaty and why it's relevant to super funds?
Well, unbelievably, nuclear weapons have been legal until that treaty entered into force in 2021. What that treaty does, it puts it on the same status as chemical weapons and biological weapons, landmines and cluster munitions. And so these weapons are now illegal under international law and clearly what we call controversial weapons. People have a trouble thinking about nuclear weapons, but think about putting your super into chemical weapons. And nuclear weapons are far worse than chemical weapons. But a lot of people would have no idea that their super is contributing to the manufacture of these weapons.
So, Adam, I mean, what was the most surprising finding from the research?
Look, I think the most surprising and probably the most shocking finding from the research was that 2 of those 14 funds didn't just invest in their default My Super investment option, but they actually had investments in nuclear weapons companies in their ethical options, or so-called ethical options. So Australian Super had investments in 8 nuclear weapons companies in what it calls its socially aware option, and those investments amounted to $20 million. And then the other fund investing in nuclear weapons companies through its ethical option was Spirit Super, which had investments in 10 companies. So I think the most shocking thing about this research is that it shows there's a clear disconnect between what an ordinary member of the public or a prospective member of one of these super funds might think ethical or socially aware or responsible means, and then what these companies are actually doing through their investment practices in these ethical funds. Another interesting finding was that Hester, one of the bigger funds, they had applied a 5% revenue threshold to their investments in nuclear weapons companies. So what that means was that they wouldn't invest in any company that received 5% or more of its revenue from the manufacture of nuclear weapons. But as of December 2023, they still had $280 million of investments in those nuclear weapons companies. It's worth noting that we had subsequent correspondence with them after we did the research, and they said that that data was slightly out of date. So as of the end of June this year, they had divested from some of those nuclear weapons companies. And they still had $130 million invested in nuclear weapons companies. So I think what this shows is that funds that choose to deal with nuclear weapons investments with a revenue threshold, it doesn't actually stop them from investing in nuclear weapons companies.
So, Adam, on the basis of that data, you've talked about how many super funds were kind of involved, but how do you find out this? How do you find out that a super fund is invested, and why do they end up invested in nuclear weapons?
So all of the super funds have to publish all of their investments online, and any member of the public can go and download a list of all of their investments, and it gives you how much money they've invested in different companies, what percentage of their overall investment portfolio that is. Theoretically, it's possible for any member of the public to find out. What we found was that this data is not presented in a particularly accessible way, and it took quite a lot of time to comb through it and figure out where this money was going. And, you need background knowledge on which companies are actually involved in nuclear weapons. So it's good that they publish the data, but it's difficult to actually find out, whether it's going into nuclear weapons companies and how much is going in there.
Yeah. And Margaret, I mean, presumably some of these super funds, or all of them, they have a tool called screening where they would exclude certain companies from investments on the basis of, various things. How do nuclear weapons sneak through those kinds of screens? What are we talking about here?
Well, 8 out of the 14 funds exclude controversial weapons. Now, controversial weapons are weapons that kill civilians indiscriminately and leave lasting impacts on the environment. And they just have these definitions of controversial weapons that conveniently leave out nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are the worst of all the controversial weapons.
I like to say it's because they're uncontroversially bad weapons.
Indeed, but it's interesting that they recognise that some weapons are just too awful to put money into, but somehow nuclear weapons, they give a free pass, and that is really not acceptable, particularly now they're illegal under international law.
Yeah. And I mean, that just sounds so stupid to me, like that you could have such a definition and that somehow a nuclear weapon wouldn't fall under that definition. I mean, is really ridiculous. They're having a lend, aren't they?
Absolutely.
And Margaret, how have the super funds responded in recent years? Are any of them really moving out of nuclear weapons investments in general? Is there any trends or anything in the data?
When we started in May, we let the funds know we were doing research. In July, we sent them all our results, and our summary of what we thought of their fund. And then when the research came out, suddenly, I mean, they came back to us and said, yes, your results are correct. And then when the research came out, 2 of the funds came out and said, oh, no, the data's wrong, when they were contacted by journalists. And one of them was Hester, who had divested a lot. And the second one was Aware, which Aware, in fact, by percentage, has the most nuclear weapons. It's 0.9%. And they said, oh, no, their data's wrong. And we're thinking, well, actually, the data, you need to think about this. I mean, I think a lot of the funds don't want to think about it, or they don't want it to come out into the public light.
But the data was right, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Both sets of data were absolutely correct. Well, in terms of 2021, we did a report. Since then, we know Host Plus is no longer in nuclear weapons. We know Vanguard's not in nuclear weapons, Future Super, Australian Ethical. There's a number of funds that are not invested in nuclear weapons. The Responsible Investment Association of Australia, after we went and spoke with them, also made all their products have to be out of nuclear weapons. So that was a big step forward, and a number of their products have got rid of their nuclear weapons. So there has been progress, but it's slow. Care Super, which is in the process of merging with Spirit Super, have said to us we've met with them a number of occasions, and also they've said to us that they will be, once the merger is complete, they'll be looking to get out of nuclear weapons, and I think they're sincere about that. But Australian Super is ignoring the fact that when we did research in 2021 for our previous report, 7 out of 10 Australians do not want nuclear weapons in their superannuation, and 8 out of 10 Australians say, if you're going to have nuclear weapons in your superannuation, you should tell us. It's this business that people don't think about nuclear weapons. It's quite hard to think about. It's much easier to think about dinner or the football or something than nuclear weapons. And I think most people would be very surprised to find that their superannuation is partially in nuclear weapons producing companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And like telling people if your super's invested in nuclear weapons seems like the absolute bare minimum as well. But one of the arguments against divestment is that doing so would be against the financial interests of their customers. I mean, what's your response to that?
Well, it's twofold. What's really been terrific for this report particularly is that we managed to get 3 different data sets that actually did an analysis of what happens if you take nuclear weapons out of your portfolio. And in fact, it makes no difference at all, because all these investments are, relative to the rest of the fund, very small. Most of them are less than 0.5%. And when you look at the data of these 3, big data sets, that doesn't make any difference. Anything that's slightly better to be out of nuclear weapons. The second issue is actually, with superannuation, you should be taking a long-term view. And if over the next 30 years we are unlucky enough to have nuclear war, a limited nuclear war, which is what people say is the next, anyway, I won't go into the size of the nuclear war, but even that would have an appalling effect on global supply chains, on manufacturing, and would probably lead to the collapse of the global financial system as it is. And that's in nobody's best financial interest. And so the trustees should be looking at longer term issues.
Putin has made his darkest and most specific threats yet about using nuclear weapons against the West.
As President Zelensky was addressing the UN, President Putin here was addressing his Security Council about changing Russia's nuclear doctrine, which is the document that defines when and how Russia could use nuclear weapons.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is classic Putin right now. A lot of nuclear threatening comments. He's talking about this Burevestnik missile.
Let's start off by talking about this moment, this escalation between Iran and Israel.
I think it's very likely that the nuclear program could be a target for several reasons. First, this is something that Prime Minister Netanyahu, beyond any other Israeli politician, has recognized as the existential threat for Israel.
Margaret, you said, I'm not going to get into all that, but I mean, let's face it, there is escalating conflict in the Middle East. There's obviously the war in Gaza. There is the war on Ukraine. Like, the threat of nuclear weapons being deployed feels a lot more live now than it has, I think, in many recent years, even if you're a person who more often than not worries about dinner and never opens your mail from your superannuation company, fund. But I mean, it is a very big issue facing the world, and it seems actually, like the risk is greater or heightened at the moment than it normally is.
Yes, I think it's true. And I also think sort of very low risk but high impact things do happen. I mean, you've got COVID, you've got the CrowdStrike episode. Things come out of the blue that you haven't actually thought about. And since the Cuban Missile Crisis way back in the 60s, there's more than a dozen times that we've come within a whisker of nuclear war. But people still don't realise these weapons have to be eliminated. And it's not a fast process. It's going to need sort of long negotiations and balanced reductions in stockpiles that are verifiable. But we have to start somewhere, and delegitimising these weapons and making the cost of capital more expensive is a good first step.
Mm. And Adam, I guess Margaret was talking there about the fact that if super funds do divest from nuclear weapons, that not only does it not really make any difference financially, but it's also just such a small proportion, by the sounds of it, of their overall holdings. How can listeners find out whether or not their super fund is invested in nuclear weapons?
Well, I would say the first place to go would be our report, because, we look at the 14 biggest public offer super funds and see whether they invest in nuclear weapons companies. If your super fund isn't included in that report, you can go onto the super fund's website and download a list of all of their investments, which is they have to publish every year. And you can comb through that if you would like. But I think the most important thing to do would be to tell your super company that you actually care whether your money is invested in nuclear weapons. I mean, most super funds probably think that people don't care, but I think that the majority of people would be shocked to hear that their money, which is going to fund their retirement, is at the same time funding nuclear weapons. So, share our report. If our report found that your fund invests in nuclear weapons, write to your super fund and tell them that you care. We've seen that this kind of pressure does work. I mean, as Margaret was saying, since 2021, various funds have divested from nuclear weapons and other funds are planning on doing so. So if you show that you care, then change could happen.
And Margaret, what's your message to Australian super funds who are still currently invested?
I think they need to take a good look at themselves, really, because these are terrible weapons, and it's easy. Most 8 out of the 14 already exclude controversial weapons. All they have to do is change their definition of controversial weapons. So it's very simple, and there are really good international companies that provide screens that are not. I mean, it's simple for the funds to do. They just need to actually think about what a survivor of Hiroshima said, Setsuko Thurlow. She said, with the treaty coming through, that these weapons have always been immoral. They're now illegal. I'd just say, if people can email their super funds upfront, I think looking for the data is really hard. I'm intensely grateful for the research the Australia Institute provided Adam and Olivia, who really did the hard work in terms of crunching the numbers. Just email your super fund, get in their contact list, email your super fund, say, do you have nuclear weapons? And don't let them brush you off with the ethical fund. Say, do you have in your entire fund investments in nuclear weapons companies, and see what they come back with.
Thanks for joining us on the show today, Margaret and Adam.
Thanks, Ebony.
Thank you.
You can find the full report on super investments in nuclear weapons via the link in the show notes. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.